All right, David, it's all you.
All right, then. Well, hello and welcome to everybody who is listening to our continuing series, the Slavery or Freedom Conference, a now digital online conference extending all week, Monday through Friday. So please check out not only this session, but other sessions coming forward. That's the general advertisement. Right now, I am delighted to introduce Professor Paul A. Rahe of Hillsdale College, who is giving the talk, The 1619 Project and the American Founding. And I just want to say a little bit about Dr. Rahe. Read Literae Humaniores at Wadham College, Oxford. I'm sure I mispronounced that. On a Rhodes Scholarship, completed a PhD in ancient history at Yale University under the direction of the very esteemed Donald Kagan in 1977. A distinguished teaching career, an extraordinarily distinguished publication career. Sorry, I only say extraordinarily because I've read your books, but I haven't taken your classes. That's not meant to be invidious. But the republics include, books include Republics Ancient and Modern, Classical Republicanism and the American Revolution, Democracy's Drift, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and de Tocqueville on the Modern Prospect, and a wonderful series on Sparta most recently, the grand strategy of classical Sparta, the Spartan regime, Sparta's first Attic War, and coming soon, I believe that's still forthcoming, though it might be out by now, Sparta's second Attic War, the grand strategy of Sparta, 446 to 418 BC, and pages more of wonderful things he's done. But let me hand it over. I will hand it over to Paul Rahe and just say, after his speech, we will then be answering questions. Please put them in by the chat or the question, the answer. Dr. Rahe may be looking at those himself, but he's not. I'll pass on questions for other people. Thank you, Dr. Rahe.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank David Randall of the National Association of Scholars and Peter Wood for inviting me. By the way, Sparta's Second Attic War was released on the 4th of August. Nicole Hannah Jones' treatment of the American founding in her introduction to the 1619 Project has two distinguishing features. It makes broad claims that cannot be sustained by the enormous body of evidence that we have concerning the origins and character of the American Revolution, and it abstracts almost entirely from the history of the world up to that time. It's the latter issue that I want to begin with, because the significance of the American Revolution in general and its import for the institution of slavery can only be understood when set in the context of what came before. Prior to the American Revolution, slavery was the norm, not the exception. It appears to have been coeval with civilization. It existed in ancient Sumeria, Akkad, Elam, Assyria, Chaldean Babylon, Israel, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. It existed from time immemorial in China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and India. It existed later throughout the Muslim world, in Africa, and among the Aboriginal population of North and South America. By the early modern period, it had pretty much died out in Europe thanks to a prohibition against Christians enslaving their co-religionists. But in and after Columbus's day, it was a presence nearly everywhere in the New World where Christians from Europe encountered pagans. In general, peoples did not enslave their own. Slavery presupposed what Orlando Patterson calls natal alienation, which is to say slaves are almost uniformly outsiders. The emergence of universal religions extended the restriction. Christians were not comfortable enslaving fellow Christians. Muslims evidenced a similar reluctance. Prior to the 18th century, almost no one objected to slavery as such. From the terms of the distinction that Aristotle draws between natural slavery and slavery rooted in convention, one could draw the conclusion that no natural slave would be of real use to a master, and that the slavery that did exist was rooted in municipal law and in convention, but was unjust. However, I know of no one who followed through on what Aristotle implied. And Aristotle himself, when he describes the best regime, presupposes that slavery will be required. It was widely supposed that absent some sort of system of subjection, high civilization was impossible. Taking their cue from the first few chapters of Genesis, where man is said to be created in the image and likeness of God, a number of church fathers asserted what Aristotle never even intimated, the natural equality of man. And this had a significant impact, but it did not, for a very long time anyway, eventuate in a critique of aristocracy or the institution of slavery as such. For Christians tended to think that what was true in the eyes of God need not be applicable in the city of man. In the late 16th century, however, Jean Bodin did articulate a critique of slavery, but to no effect. It was not until the publication of John Locke's two treatises of government in 1690 that one can find an articulation of a teaching concerning justice that is inconsistent with the existence of the institution of slavery as an institution. And Locke, who had once owned stock in the Royal African Company and who had in the 1660s drafted a constitution for the Carolinas that included a provision for slavery, did not point out the implications for European practice in the New World of his denial that anything other than unjust aggression could legitimate the enslavement of anyone, and his attendant assertion that no one could legitimately be born into slavery. Others, however, soon did so. Gershom Carmichael, for example, in the lectures he delivered at the University of Glasgow early in the 18th century, and in the notes to the editions of Pufendorf's De Officio Hominis et Civis that he published in Edinburgh in 1718 and 1724. And his successor in the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow, Francis Hutcheson, did the same in a short introduction to moral philosophy, which he published in 1747, and in a system of moral philosophy, which he brought out 8 years thereafter. Influence of these two academic Scots and their interpretation of Locke was, however, limited. The first figure of profound pan-European influence to denounce slavery was Montesquieu. In 1732, in his Considerations on the Causes of the Greatness of the Romans and Their Decline, he intimated what he later said openly, describing the ancient Romans as men accustomed to making sport of human nature in the person of their children and slaves, and suggesting that men of this sort could scarcely be acquainted with the virtue that we call humanity. 16 years later, in the spirit of the laws, he attacked slavery as an institution contrary to nature that causes men to forget that they are all born equal. Under its influence, he added, the masters insensibly become accustomed to lacking all the moral virtues. It loosens, he said, the reins on their incontinence, and it renders them haughty, curt, unfeeling, irascible, voluptuous, and cruel. What happened in Jamestown in 1619, 129 years before the publication of the Spirit of the Laws, and 71 years before the publication of Locke's two treatises of government, was not an event of profound importance, as this discussion should make obvious. It was business as usual. The sort of thing that was going on that year outside Western Europe in nearly every corner of the globe among Asians, Africans, Turks, Arabs, American Indians, and yes, all over the New World by Europeans. Moreover, slavery was a practice then essentially unquestioned. What happened in the North American colonies between 1762 and 1776 was another matter, however. It initiated a transformation of world historical importance, rooted in the distinctive heritage of the West, by which I mean philosophy and Christianity, that eventuated in the abolition of slavery, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world. To suggest that, quote, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was that they wanted to protect the institution of slavery, unquote. To claim that the Americans would, quote, never have revolted against Britain, unquote, if the founders, quote, had not believed that independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue, unquote. To assert that neither Jefferson nor most of the founders intended to abolish slavery, as Nicole Hannah-Jones does in that introduction, is to display either gross ignorance or malice and dishonesty. And I think it's the latter. The 1619 Project is a piece of agitprop. And the proof of it is that Nicole Hannah-Jones spoke of the recent violence in the United States uproariously as the 1619 riots. It mattered profoundly in 1776, as it still matters now, that Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, with full support from the Continental Congress, chose to ground the American colonies' justification for independence not on the traditional rights of Englishmen, but on the laws of nature and nature's God as they apply to all human beings, announcing, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We should all, black and white, repeat with some frequency what Abraham Lincoln wrote 83 years later. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary doctrine an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. Jefferson himself, in turning down an invitation to speak in Washington, D.C. on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, wrote regarding that document and that event, may it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. As for slavery itself, when he revised the laws of Virginia in 1779, Jefferson prepared an amendment providing for the emancipation of all slaves born after the passing of the act, directing that they should continue with their parents to a certain age, then be brought up at the public expense to tillage, arts, or sciences according to their geniuses, till the females shall be 18 and the males 21 years of age, when they should be colonized to such place as the circumstances of the time should render most proper, sending them out with arms, implements of household and of the handicraft arts, seeds, pairs of the useful domestic animals, and to declare them a free and independent people and extend to them our alliance and protection till they shall have acquired strength. Later, as a member of the Continental Congress, Jefferson pressed for barring slavery from all the Western territories, and the proposal he drafted, which became the model for the unanimously adopted Northwest Ordinance of 1787, would have passed when it came up for a vote in 1784, had it not been for the absence due to illness of a single delegate from New Jersey. Moreover, in 1783, Jefferson drafted a revised constitution for Virginia, barring the importation of slaves and specifying that all children born of slaves after 31 December 1800 be declared free. And he later published that draft as an appendix to his Notes on the State of Virginia. In that tract, which appeared in Paris in French in 1785 and in the United States in English in 1787, he wrote, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution in the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. If slavery was eventually brought to an end in North America 78 years later, and if it was subsequently outlawed worldwide, it was because of the argument articulated during the course of the American Revolution and embraced by the founding generation. One can, of course, charge Jefferson and his generation with failing to follow through fully on the conviction to which they had come in the years stretching from 1762 to 1776. In New England and Pennsylvania, slavery was outlawed with some alacrity. In New Jersey and New York, this eventually took place. But in Delaware, Maryland, and states further south, the movement towards emancipation stalled, and slavery actually expanded as Southerners and others migrated to the Southwest. But this is not entirely surprising, and though regrettable, it is not shocking. Where it was fundamentally easy to eliminate slavery, where it was not economically fundamental, it was eliminated. Where the consequences would have been economically devastating, where families would have lost their wherewithal, the revolutionary generation fell short. They were, after all, human, all too human. And in places like Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina, their material interests were profoundly at odds with their sentiments. In his attitude towards slavery, Patrick Henry may have been a typical Virginian. In a personal letter written in 1773 and not intended for publication, he was frank. He acknowledged that it left him dumbfounded that in an age which could boast of high improvements in the arts and sciences and refined morality, that age should also have brought into use and guarded by many laws a species of violence and tyranny, which our more rude, barbarous, but more honest ancestors detested. He found it amazing that at a time when the rights of humanity are defined and understood with a precision in a country above all others fond of liberty, that in such an age and such a country we find men adopting a principle as repugnant to humanity as it is inconsistent with the Bible and destructive to liberty. Of course, he remarked, every thinking, honest man rejects slavery in speculation. But he asked, how few in practice from conscientious motives? In juxtaposing theory and practice, Henry knew only too well whereof he spoke. Would anyone believe, he exclaimed in dismay, in the same letter, that I am master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I will not, I cannot justify it. He could only affirm his belief that a time will come when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil. In the interim, it was his duty and that of his compatriots to transmit to our descendants, together with our slaves, a pity for their unhappy lot and an abhorrence for slavery. In the short run, he thought, one could not reasonably hope for a greater consummation. Jefferson and others hoped that with tobacco cultivation exhausting the soil, his fellow Virginians would find it necessary to turn to wheat and other crops less well suited to slave labor. And he hoped that anti-slavery sentiment would deepen at the same time. In one passage in his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, The minds of our citizens may be ripening for a complete emancipation of human nature. In another, he added, I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution. The spirit of the master is abating that of the slave, rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, the way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation, and that this is disposed in the order of events to be with the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation. In judging the founding generation and finding them wanting, as we should be well advised to consider how many of our contemporaries, white or black, who have families, would make a sacrifice comparable to the one that these men knew justice demanded of them. Reflection along these lines might go a long way toward reducing indignation and introducing a modicum of moderation into our councils. It was once said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. The cost of emancipation was one problem. There were others. In the 1790s, manumission in states like Maryland and Virginia was common. The results were not, however, entirely satisfactory. Frequently, there was nothing in the experience of these freedmen as slaves that prepared them for life as free men, and they often ended up as vagrants and as a charge upon the public. As the Marylanders and Virginians learned, emancipation was not going to be an easy task. There was another problem. Jefferson addressed it in his notes on the state of Virginia. It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave? Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained. New provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but with the extermination of the one or the other race. Jefferson's fears were widely shared, and they were greatly reinforced by what his fellow slaveholders learned about the revolution that took place in Haiti in the years stretching from 1791 to 1804. This was a rebellion led by freedmen that eventuated in the massacre of much of the island's white population. It led Jefferson and others to do a turnabout and come out in favor of diffusing the slave population throughout the entirety of the United States. It was with Haiti in mind that Jefferson responded in 1820 to the Missouri controversy by writing, "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." That this sentiment was convenient, all too convenient, does not mean that it was not sincerely held, nor should these fears be dismissed as absurd. What had happened in Haiti certainly could have happened elsewhere, nor should we dismiss Jefferson's observation as immoral. The political morality grounded in social contract theory was rooted in the primacy of security. Allegiance was a function of the security afforded life, liberty, and property. Moreover, in extremis, the right to defend one's life, liberty, and property trumped all other obligations, and that right belonged to the masters as well as to those they enslaved. Let me add the obvious. Jefferson was right about the depth of white prejudice. He was, though he did not realize it, an avatar of that prejudice himself, as I could demonstrate if time allowed. White prejudice may have, for the most part, abated today, but it was alive and well as late as the mid-1960s was when I was in high school. And Black resentment and distrust is hardly gone. Without it, the 1619 Project would have been inconceivable. De facto segregation, at least partially governs our lives. And where we mix, it is tolerably often awkward. Jefferson and the founders and members of the American Colonization Society, men like James Madison, John Marshall, and Henry Clay, had an argument. So did Marcus Garvey. Whether that argument was in the end compelling is, of course, another matter. Nothing that I have said thus far, however, excuses the founding generation for its failure to properly address the twofold challenge posed by slavery. After all, it was unjust, and its continuing existence posed a threat to the survival of the Republic. What the founding generation did in response to these challenges was to take the easy way out. They punted to the generations following, and the consequences were disastrous. A grave injustice that was perpetuated and deepened as new generations were born into slavery, and a civil war that took the lives of 650 to 850,000 Americans. This was a failure of statesmanship. What the founding generation could and should have done was to bar forever the importation of slaves and put into practice a program of gradual emancipation and perhaps colonization funded by the sale of Western lands, with generous provisions made for the freedmen sent out as colonists and compensation paid to the slave owners so that slavery could be eliminated within a generation without bankrupting those who had inherited that institution. Instead, the Confederation Congress allowed the expansion of slavery into what was then the Southwest. And at the Federal Convention, the framers negotiated a compromise with South Carolina, the one state where anti-slavery sentiment was minimal, allowing for 20 years the importation of new slaves from abroad. These two acts, supplemented by the consequences of the invention of the cotton gin, which could not have been foreseen, produced the slave power. There were reasons why these compromises were made. The Union was fragile, and the South Carolinians in particular were adamant. But the extension of slavery into the Southwest and the corrupt bargain between New England and the Deep South that kept the slave trade open were unnecessary. The injustice done the human beings imported and those sent west, and the damage done the existing citizen population, both in the North and in the South, was immense. There were reasons which I have spelled out above why the founding generation punted, but they too were insufficient. They had diagnosed a cancer, then instead of excising it, they allowed it to grow. They perpetuated and expanded the scope of an institution they knew to be and proclaimed unjust. And they inflicted on those who came after a nightmare that remains, at least in some small measure, alive to this day. The institution's perpetuation and expansion had another terrible consequence that Jefferson should have foreseen. The spirit of the master did not abate. It increased. When sentiments and interests are profoundly at odds, one or the other is bound over time to give way. Either the interest, in this case, the interest of the slaveholder, must be eliminated by gradual emancipation, or sentiments will gradually come into accord with those interests. Institutions and deeply embedded practices educate. Tradition has authority. It elicits approval. One cannot pass to one's progeny, as was suggested, slaves and an abhorrence of slavery. Jefferson understood this. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, "There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unromantic despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. This quality is the germ of all education in him. From his cradle to grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. If a parent could find no motive, either in his philanthropy or his self-love, for restraining the intemperance of passion towards his slave, it should always be a sufficient one that his child is present. But generally, it is not sufficient. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circles of smaller slaves, gives loose to his worst passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. As everyone who has had children knows, the example we set is more influential than the words we preach. By acquiescing in the perpetuation and an extension of an institution they knew to be evil, Jefferson's generation of American statesmen taught their children and grandchildren not to take seriously the anti-slavery sentiments they voiced. It is not surprising that in and after the 1820s, we find an ever-increasing number of slaveholders arguing that slavery is a positive good. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Hamilton Stevens turned their backs on the sentiments voiced by the men after whom they were named, in large part because the generation to which those men belonged failed to bring the interests of well-to-do Southerners into accord with those sentiments. As Americans, we live with a paradox. Our founding was arguably the most glorious moment in human history. It ought to be a source of pride. Moreover, when it came to the shaping of institutions, the statesmanship of the founders is for the most part admirable. But they did fall short in one crucial regard. And for that, we are still paying, both black and white, a considerable price. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Professor Rahe, Dr. Rahe. Wonderful speech. I'm going to remind people who are watching, please send in your questions and to the question and answer box at the bottom, the chat box at the bottom. If you can't figure that out, in extremis, by email to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL. I'll start with the first question, which we have up. Why did you start with 1762? Why that date in particular?
Well, the history of the revolution is a history of change and sentiments. In 1762, the Americans were proud to be Englishmen. And between 1762 and 1776, they ceased to be Englishmen. In 1762, they, at the end of the French and Indian War, they thought of their rights as the rights of Englishmen. By 1776, they could no longer remain Englishmen and could make no claims to the rights of Englishmen. And so gradually in between those two times, they moved in the direction of John Locke and the notion of natural rights. And it is in that period, as a consequence of that motion, that they began to think critically about the way they lived themselves. There was slavery in every American colony. By the time the Constitutional Convention met, it had been abolished in New England and in Pennsylvania. So you can see the motion that is taking place. And that motion has to do with thinking through things that they had never had occasion to think through before. And so I begin in 1762 because that's the year the Americans got word that the Stamp Act was coming. And it's the Stamp Act that begins that process of rethinking. And let me say, the first pamphlet written against the Stamp Act equates the rights of Englishmen with the natural rights as articulated by John Locke in two treatises of government. Locke comes to be spoken of more and more as you move towards 1776. But he's there. They have read him. They have not thought very much about him. and they've not thought about the implications of Locke for them.
So I guess a related question, I mean, this is, how much should we be thinking of the Declaration of the Independence and the Constitution as part of, like, making the same sorts of arguments? How much are they in tension? And I guess in particular with the relationship with the 1619 Project and its and the issues of race.
Well, the Constitution is a statement of principles. Excuse me, the Declaration of Independence is a statement of principles. The Constitution is a practical document meant to put those principles into practice insofar as that could be done. So the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is the tension that always exists between theory and practice. There are always going to be compromises of one sort or another with those abstract principles. And in the American case, the sort of facts upon the ground, which is to say the existence of slavery, is a key issue. One of the things that people like John Adams in the North say is you cannot simply, suddenly free the slaves. They'll starve. And that's right. And the manumissions that took place in Maryland and Virginia were by and large not so very successful.
Okay. So I'm going to follow up now with a question from the audience. Sorry, I'm going back and forth a bit here. How should we counter the erroneous claims of the 1619 Project? And what are some good tactics to correct those with whom we disagree?
Well, I think you need to start. I picked Jefferson. And I picked him because he is a target mentioned explicitly in the introduction to the 1619 Project. But what you see is what he's trying to do. And he has a plan that he tries in the 1780s and late 1770s to put into effect to eliminate slavery. So he not only articulates the principles in the Declaration of Independence, and look, he does that with full support from everybody else. He wrestles with the question, how are we going to live up to those principles? And he knows, he has profound knowledge of the obstacles, which is in places like Virginia and South Carolina in particular, the interests of the people who made the revolution and slavery are intimately entangled. He's also aware that you can't simply free the slaves. So the thing has to be done in a systematic way in which there is provision, training to operate as free men, and so forth. So I would point to that. But the second thing I would say to someone who finds himself in this argument is, tell me a time in human history when people have sacrificed not just their personal interests, but the interest of their families, have chosen bankruptcy, not just for themselves, but for their families, in order to achieve justice. And in other words, the challenge faced by that generation was formidable. Now, as my talk suggests, I think they should have faced that challenge squarely. And I think people like Jefferson and Madison, because it would have to come from the South. The North would be amenable. The North was amenable, in fact.
Right.
But the proposals would have to come from the South. We have to do something about this. We have to do it in this generation, or the cancer will grow. And what they did is they punted. So I fault Patrick Henry, Jefferson, Madison, really the Virginians and the South Carolinians for not recognizing that if you perpetuate it in the hope that something will come along and save you, you are far, far likelier to make it much worse.
So we have got a comment, which is, it's in effect pushing back against, the punting. I'll just, so a comment, Ray Sanchez, I don't think our founding fathers could have made another decision or implemented a way to eliminate slavery in a generation. There wouldn't have been a union to begin with. They did punt, yes, but it was a purposeful punt, knowing there was only one result that could come from that fourth down play. And then a comparison, should the United States have negotiated with Stalin's regime following World War II? We knew who he was and what his totalitarian communism would try to do to Europe, and yet we negotiated. There was no other option but to negotiate, away Eastern Europe following the weariness of a world war. The founders negotiated a union with the evil of slavery still attached, but the outcome was never in doubt. It just took 75-ish years. So pushback, strong and vigorous from your audience.
Yes, well, he could have quoted Paul Rahe against Paul Rahe, because that's something like the position I took in the chapter I wrote on this in Republics Ancient and Modern. I have since altered my opinion on that question. The real question is obviously a question of prudence, which is, how do you cope? And there are various evils. And there is no question, if you're operating within a Lockean context, that your own self-preservation comes first. Other things come second. But one of the things that individual said is wrong. It was not inevitable that it be eliminated. It was not inevitable that in the North, there would be forces that would stand up and resist. It is perfectly conceivable that slavery might have been extended to the entire country by a decision of the United States Supreme Court. And such a decision was on its way. Someone had taken slaves to New York. They were freed there, and he'd gone to federal court arguing the right to bring one's property wherever one wanted to go. And Justice Taney was preparing a decision following up on the logic of Dred Scott. Now, let me intervene with something here. Justice Taney began as anti-slavery. He was a Marylander. He freed all of his slaves. It did not work out well for those slaves. He was a defender in court of abolitionists all the way up to 1818. So he's an example of a change of opinion in the South, and of a pretty radical one. But no, I don't think it was inevitable that an Abraham Lincoln would appear, that he would articulate the arguments that he articulated in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. I think had he not appeared, Douglas would have become president of the United States. And the South would, in fact, have won what it was seeking. And the North would have gone along with it. I don't think there was anything inevitable about it at all. That's why I changed my mind. I look at the thing and I think, this is a cancer that grows and grows and grows. Now, the other side is the question whether you could have had the Union. And there, I think the answer is twofold. I do not believe that you had to have 20-year importation of slaves. I think they could have called South Carolina's bluff. Now, someone might say, what about Georgia? And I would say, yeah, what about Georgia? When Georgia ratified the Constitution, Savannah was being besieged by Indians. Georgia was on the border with Spain, with Spanish territories, and Georgia desperately needed a federal government. Georgia would not have followed South Carolina. And I don't think South Carolina would have had a choice. It was the only state with a majority Black population, majority slave population. It was the one most in danger of slave rebellion. And if the other states had said no, they'd have had to knuckle under. So I don't think that was a condition. And by the way, James Madison is with me on that. The opposition to reopening the slave trade or allowing it to be open for 20 years came from the mid-Atlantic states, from Pennsylvania, from Maryland, from Virginia. In fact, the most eloquent attack on this question of allowing the importation of slaves came from Luther Martin of Maryland. And he said everything that could be said on that subject. The Virginians were on the other side on that question. Now, the larger question, however, that I think your questioner didn't really address is the point I am making about what needed to be done by the Virginians themselves. In other words, I perfectly well agree. If the North said a condition for being part of the Union is that the South abolish slavery, they'd have gotten their backs up. There's plenty of evidence to that effect. But the failure of statesmanship was a failure of Virginia statesmanship in Virginia. And had they gotten Virginia behind gradual emancipation, the North would have backed it and the Western lands would have been used in that way. So it seems, Jefferson falls silent on slavery. He doesn't have much more to say on it. And when his former secretary, Robert Coles, who was one of the secretaries for Jefferson during his presidency, decides that he's going to sell his land in Virginia, take his slaves to the Illinois territory and free them, buy land for them and settle them on it, Jefferson objects. I mean, I don't think they faced necessity. Whereas, in fighting Hitler, we had to swallow quite a lot. In that regard, Winston Churchill said to an aide, if the devil would join an alliance with us against Hitler, I would have a few words of praise for him in the House of Commons. I mean, yes, prudence is absolutely required, and yes, absolute justice is unachievable. Yes, self-preservation takes priority. Nonetheless, they didn't have to punt.
Thank you. By me, that's a wonderful answer. I trust if Mr. Sanchez wants more, please write some more on the screen. I'm going to shift back to a different question. There's actually a few pushbacks, I think, on our various founding fathers, but Jefferson, here's something on context. Wasn't Jefferson arguing more against divine right of kings when he said all men are created equal than he was arguing that all men were or should be equal, particularly given his views expressed on Blacks and Indians in the notes on the state of Virginia?
No. If you look at his first draft, he attacks the king for allowing the slave trade, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And he blames, this is a little disingenuous, slavery in America on the king, as if the people in America weren't perfectly happy to buy slaves. And that was taken out. He was forced to rewrite And he was forced by the likes of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who were not at that time slave owners. So no. Was he hostile to priestcraft? Yes, of course. Did he harp on it? Of course, that's easy. But he harped on other things. You know, think about the business of God wouldn't take our side in a race war. That's pretty strong language. Now, did Jefferson embody prejudice? Yes. I'm of the view that the word racism is like the word Marxism. It was coined to describe a doctrine, and that the proper phrase for talking about what is often termed racism is racial prejudice or color prejudice. Jefferson was a racist. That is to say, he toyed with it at least. He articulated an argument about lack of intelligence on the part of Blacks. That, by the way, sets him at odds with Alexander Hamilton, who was of the opposite view, perhaps because he had lived among African slaves in the Caribbean and had worked closely with them, where he was not a master. He was yet another low-level person. And Jefferson's articulating of a kind of hypothetical argument about Black inferiority lays a foundation for the later argument of those who argue that slavery is a positive good, that the Blacks have to have other people to rule them. Jefferson doesn't go that far, but you can see that he pioneers the path. I alluded to that in the talk. I think the Virginians really fell short.
And I may want to return to that one because there's a bunch of questions I think have to do with that. But on a slightly different thing, from Matthew Post, Dr. Rahe has mentioned the influence of John Locke on Jefferson, among others. I was wondering if Dr. Rahe could expand on his remarks. How prevalent was Locke's influence on the founders generally, e.g. on attitudes toward liberty and slavery? What parts of Locke's teaching were taken more fully? What parts less so? You're only allowed 5 or 6 books to answer this with.
Yeah. Look, the answer is in the period from 1762 to 1776, no author is mentioned, cited, and quoted in North America as often as John Locke. The issue of independence and the right to the revolution turns on the arguments made by John Locke. And in particular, the issue is the right of a man to the fruits of his own labor. And therefore, taxes have to be a free contribution. Now, when you join a community, you accept majority rule. But you don't accept that a parliament in England that doesn't represent you in any way can make those decisions. It can only be done through your colonial legislatures. So the heart of the Lockean argument is Locke's discussion of labor in the fifth chapter it is, of the Second Treatise of Government, and the manner in which his argument about revolution grows out of that. Well, the people who were making that argument were taking the fruits of other people's labor. And they could see it. It was sort of obvious once you began to justify yourself with one set of principles, you realize that set of principles puts you in a difficult light. So that's how it happened. And the interesting thing is they forged on with those principles. And and articulated an argument that was, as Lincoln puts it, a stumbling block. And it was a stumbling block for the perpetuation of slavery. Now, I don't believe that the mere articulation of that argument was sufficient to guarantee outlawing slavery. But absent the articulation of that argument, there wouldn't have been any chance.
All right, thank you. And well, and again to the people commenting, but this is for everybody. If you have follow-up questions, please post them too, since it'd be lovely to have you back and forth. I will go back, however, to a different question. Jennifer Bryan, if George Washington had freed his own slaves during his lifetime rather than in his will, would that not have prodded more slave owners to follow their sentiments rather than their interests? And I just want to say, I think this speaks directly to your bit about the failure of the Virginians. What more could they have done? This perhaps being the ultimate example of what might have shifted sentiments.
Yeah. On the other hand, had he done so, he would have bankrupted himself and left his wife in a very difficult position. And that's the obstacle. What he didn't do was champion emancipation that would be paid for out of the common American funds. And that proposal was in the air. It was talked about. But the Virginians didn't kind of get together as they could have and make that the most important thing that they had to deal with. Instead, they took up the quarrel with the Federalists.
I have a follow-up question. Would Northerners have been willing to pay taxes for that sort of gradual emancipation?
It's a good question. The taxes would have come in the form of excise on whiskey and things like that, or tariffs. And I believe they would have accepted an argument for some taxes and some tariffs, because they understood that the problem was a national problem. In other words, the survival of the Union to some degree turned on this problem. And they knew that from the very beginning. People like Hamilton certainly knew it. I mean, that's what worried him. And the reason for the national bank and the national debt and all of that and Hamilton's argument about it is to try to bind wealthy people in the South and wealthy people into the North to the interests of the Union so that they all owned a chunk of that debt. And he was deeply upset when Southern planters did not buy national debt.
Thank you. And I want to then, so this is a little higgledy-piggledy as I go from one question to another.
Sure.
This is a reply to some of the previous points you were making. So about whether there was the option to ratify differently the Constitution. Georgia may have had little choice but to ratify, but North Carolina was slow to join the Union, and Virginia was a close call, to say nothing of New York. Holdouts of whatever number would have presented an invitation to outside powers to intervene, and a partial union may have quickly crumbled under the pressure. Commenter then says, even so, I'm inclined to agree that the framers should have taken some chance. Nevertheless, I guess this is a question of the prudence of pushing for more vigorous anti-slavery action at the time of the ratification.
Well, keep in mind, the provision keeping the slave trade open was an obstacle to ratification in the North. Look, you might be able to justify perpetuating slavery with the wolf by the ears argument. But making new slaves? Importing people? In effect, funding the enslavement of people in Africa who were not already slaves? that was really hard for people to swallow. And so if you're looking at the anti-federalist arguments in the North, among those anti-federalist arguments were exactly that. Even by the way, in Maryland, Luther Martin became an anti-federalist. He had a variety of reasons for doing so, but he was the most eloquent critic of slavery on the floor of the Constitutional Convention. And by the way, when he writes his anti-federalist writings after the convention, slavery looms really large. And I presume, I don't know that he was a slaveholder, but I presume he was. So it's the other thing is I wouldn't worry about North Carolina. It didn't amount to much, population-wise, wealth-wise. Virginia had real weight. Massachusetts had real weight. South Carolina was going to have weight. Pennsylvania had weight. If Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia voted to ratify, they would carry the rest of the country north of North Carolina with them. And for economic reasons, if no other, the North Carolinians would have followed suit in time, which is what they did. And Rhode Island was the last. Most corrupt state in the Union then, and except for Louisiana now.
Oh dear. Poor Rhode Island. A question, and in fact, part of what your presentation starts as is how the theories of liberalism and republicanism create the context for anti-slavery sentiment, abolitionism. And I guess one thing that's interesting is the dynamic by which the questions of race and slavery then sort of move centrally into that tradition, I guess I would say, such that by 1860, and Lincoln, it's sort of right there at the center. I mean, I guess my question is, to what extent is slavery and race beginning to change the traditions of liberalism or republicanism, by the end of the founding generation?
Can you give me a year? Is it the year that 1836 when James Madison dies, or do you mean earlier? 1826 when Jefferson dies?
I was going to start actually just with through 1800 to sort of like constrain the question, but if you wanted to push it forward.
Well, no. Okay, let's go to 1800. The key change is the turnabout that Jefferson and other Virginians make. And that has to do with diffusion of slaves. They look at their situation in light of Haiti, and they are afraid. And their excuse for perpetuating slavery is it's not safe to free the slaves. And Jefferson then argues, but if you were to diffuse the slaves over the entire territory of the United States, the relative numbers of any slave of slaves in any locale would be low enough that we could cope. So they actually, in a certain sense, Jefferson, Madison too, foreshadowed Dred Scott. Not the principles on which Dred Scott is based, but the diffusion of slavery throughout the Union. And these were the people who wanted to close it out of all the Western territories.
I might want to then go back to the time thing. I actually have two new questions which I want to combine, which I think are sort of connected. How do I answer the claim made so frequently by the 1619 journalists the Constitution was pro-slavery, and then related, the most damaging aspect of the 1619 1619 Project seems to be its assertion that racism is in America's DNA, suggesting that it is not amenable to social change and progress. And this minimizes the history of the United States since the civil rights movements of the early 1960s. How can we reaffirm the progress that has been made and renew a positive view of America? And as I said, I think the Constitution, pro-slavery question, and everything since civil rights question, I think these are linked.
Well, look, Jefferson thought that racial prejudice was apt to be a permanent feature. He had a case, and those who argue that racial prejudice is in the American DNA, they have an argument to make. What would you say against it? Well, everything that's happened since 1964 in the last 50 years, 56 years, would suggest the opposite, that racial prejudice can abate. And it seems to have. Look, I grew up in Oklahoma. My sister at one point was a lifeguard and got rather brown. She was made to sit in the back of the bus once. It was real. There's nothing like that now. Where we fall short is in mixing. And that has to do with mutual discomfort, not with pervasive prejudice on the part of white people. Now, I'm not saying there aren't prejudiced white people. They certainly do exist. But it is nothing like what it was. I grew up in the middle of it. And I remember it very well. And at that time, there was less Black discomfort with white people than there is now. I once had, I had a good friend at Oxford who was a human rights lawyer in Kenya, and he was at a certain point driven out of Kenya, came to the United States, and I got wind of it, and I brought him into the University of Tulsa to give a talk. And the president of the University of Tulsa invited sort of all the leaders of the Black community in Tulsa to a dinner. And he and his wife were there, and I was there with my wife, and we were the only white people in the room. And I can remember a very frank conversation I had with a Black state representative who said he used to be for integration. And he wasn't anymore. And that's, I wouldn't call that a universal sentiment, and I don't know that it's a majority sentiment, but it's a more common sentiment now than it was, say, in 1967 among African Americans when I started college. Things have, in some ways, gone very well, and in other ways, not so very well. But let me come back to the Constitution. One of the things in the Constitution, and it's quite deliberate, James Madison at the convention, I teach the convention every few years to graduate students and undergraduates, and we read everything, the records of the Federal Convention. Madison and others were very eager that there be nothing in the Constitution that would appear to sanction slavery. Therefore, they kept the word out, not because they were hypocrites, but because they didn't want the fundamental law of the land to give its authority to the continued existence of slavery. So they, you know, for the provision about returning runaway slaves, they use language that's really quite awkward as English to describe the runaways. And even in the one truly toxic provision within the Constitution, the one keeping the slave trade or allowing the slave trade to be open, guaranteeing that the slave trade could be open for 20 years if states wanted to import slaves. Even there is this kind of circumlocution. Nicole Anna Jones accuses the founders of hypocrisy, but that's not what's going on. What's going on is just the opposite. And see, to understand what's so wrong with the 1619 Project, you have to understand the background. The whole world accepts slavery. These are the only people in the world who, as a people, are saying, this is wrong. And so when they create their Constitution, they go to some lengths not to provide sanction within the document for what exists at the state level, not to admit that slavery could be lawful in the federal document. And the Southerners, especially the Virginians, and in fact, it's the Virginians who pushed that question of keeping it out. And at one point, you know, with regard to the provision, the 20-year provision about the slave trade, at one part, Madison in despair says, it might be better to have no mention of the slave trade in the Constitution at all, meaning which would practically leave it open permanently, because he was bothered by even the circumlocution. And keep in mind, the crime, it's one thing to hold slaves if it's unsafe to let them go. That doesn't justify acquiring more slaves. That doesn't justify funding the enslavement of free men.
Thank you. There's a follow-up which I'm going to build upon a bit, you know, that somebody, you know, your new book ought to be called Those Dang Virginians, which you know, this is humorous.
I have things in the old book that point that way. Well, look, my hero is Alexander Hamilton, long before the musical. Hamilton and John Lorenz, the son of Henry Lorenz, the largest slaveholder in South Carolina, with support from Henry Lorenz, got it through the Continental Congress unanimously to organize African Americans in South Carolina and the Deep South to fight the British and free them. Now, this was conditional on the South Carolina legislature going along with it, and it foundered. Right. But there was a project, and what he wanted to show was these people of African descent could fight for their liberty just as whites could, and could equal the whites in capacity. They wanted to demonstrate, he wanted to demonstrate their merit, and he was persuaded of their merit because he had had a lot of experience with companionship of people of African descent in the Caribbean when he was young. No, he was a man who would bite the bullet. Now, you know, at the time, he didn't have a family, I don't think. Might have married by that time. But, you know, it's easier for single people to make sacrifices than for people who have children.
And I guess I would say, I was going to follow, it seems as if the Virginians are in some sense the quintessential Americans. They know the right, but are not full-hearted always in pursuing it. And, you know, that their ambivalences are, so, you know, you seem to have more sympathy with Hamilton, but are the Virginians perhaps the quintessential Americans in having to make the choice and making some choice as well and others imperfectly?
Well, perhaps so. I mean, what I will say is the burden that I am pushing onto them is a terrible burden. I mean, it would require an economic revolution in the South, doing without stoop labor. And I don't think you can hire people to do stoop labor on a very large scale. And that means abandoning tobacco for the most part. I mentioned this in the paper. They're wearing out the land with tobacco. And one of Jefferson's expectations is that Virginia will shift from tobacco to wheat. And wheat does not take that kind of labor, which means those slaves would have been pretty much useless. I mean, not entirely useless, but you wouldn't need very many slaves. In fact, you wouldn't need any at all. And you could hire people to do the kind of labor that's involved in growing grain. And so he hoped that this thing would transformation would take place naturally and easily. And in fact, that his fellow Virginians would have a motive for freeing slaves. Didn't quite work out that way. They had a motive for selling them west, which is what happened.
Yeah. On that somewhat ambivalent note, we have gotten to 3:15. If you wanted any final words, I would just say first, anybody who has comments which weren't answered and you wish to have them, please send your questions to, well, contact@nas.org or to me, randall@nas.org. I will then forward them to Dr. Rahe for his copious free time so that he can answer any unanswered questions directly. But Professor Rahe, did you want to have any last words before we ended this wonderful session?
If you want an argument that I'm wrong, you can read what I wrote in the 3rd volume of Republics Ancient and Modern and in the 2nd chapter, which takes the position they didn't have a whole lot of choice.
Well, and I must say, by the way, the willingness to change your mind, this is wonderful. I mean, this is what academics should be doing. So, I mean, it's wonderful to see that happening.
Only if you change it for the better. And well, look, that's always an open question.
Yeah.
Am I more right now than I was then?
Right.
And I can't be sure.
Well, we will have this conference again in 20 years and see if you've changed your mind again.
Yes, and I'll be 91.
All right. Thank you.
I'll still have my hair. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you.